the bigger problem is that both of these cities are not particularly well defended, and approaches to both of the cities have not been sufficiently well defended. And now Ukraine is building up some fortifications and defenses, but unfortunately they've started doing it fairly late, and building extensive fortification lines in winter is a big challenge. So in case if Avdiivka falls, Russians will have fairly decent opportunities to advance towards these other urban centers in Donetsk region, which should be a cause for concern for Western allies.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with Dr. Huseyn Aliyev, a lecturer in Central and East European Studies at the University of Glasgow. Huseyn's also the author of publications including Post-Communist Civil Society and the Soviet Legacy, Challenges of Democratization and Reform in the Caucasus. Huseyn, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Frontline.
Thank you very much, James.
Let's start with Ukraine's strike campaign against Russian military targets in Crimea over recent days. What's been your analysis of what we've been seeing?
The recent strikes which Ukraine conducted on some of the Russian targets in Crimea are certainly of operational importance, I would say, because they have disabled a number of stations and infrastructure that Russia has used to support its own strikes against Ukraine, including some of the military infrastructures that Russia has used to combat Ukrainian drones flying in the direction of Crimea. So there is certainly some level of efficiency in these attacks, particularly in terms of disabling Russian infrastructure for a certain period of time. But we have to keep in mind that Russia have similar installations in Crimea, and they would be able to move them around and to basically replace those destroyed facilities and equipment relatively fast. So the strike is certainly of importance, but it's not of strategic importance. And it's more about the Ukraine's ability to continue this sort of attacks regularly in order to paralyze Russian air defenses in the entire of Crimean Peninsula. We have seen so far that Ukraine simply does not have such a capacity at the moment.
It's interesting because it does feel almost like we're in a phase of the war now, Huseyn, where a lot of these attacks, sort of small victories, carry more symbolic importance than they do strategic importance. And indeed, the attack on the Saki military air base, a lot of people said, well, is that of strategic importance? But you would say not so much. It's more symbolically significant.
Yes, absolutely. We have to remember that Russia has fairly significant capacity in terms of replenishing all this military equipment that they have lost. And obviously, more high-tech items such as air defense facilities and infrastructure are a bit harder for Russia to replace, but they're still able to move around a lot of equipment from the mainland Russia into the Crimea. So it is about the frequency, and it's about the scale of the sort of attacks that Ukraine needs to continue doing in order to disable Russian infrastructure in Crimea. But we're quite far from that, although we're already in the second year of the war.
Yeah, there was a Russian military blogger who claimed recently that the purpose of these attacks from Ukraine is to try and disable Russia's air defense umbrella over Crimea. Do you see any chance of them having success in doing that in the long term?
This probably will be a huge task for Ukraine, considering the capacities that Ukraine has. Ukraine still lacks cruise missiles. It certainly still lacks ballistic missiles, and it is heavily reliant on its fleet of drones, various drones, naval drones, air drones. Which are certainly limited in their capacity to inflict serious losses on the Russian air defense capacities. And Russia certainly has a very well developed layered air defense capacities in Crimea, which is spread across the entire peninsula, and it will take enormous efforts, even possibly for a NATO alliance to disable air defenses in Crimea. So it is not likely to be something that Ukraine would be able to accomplish with its current resources.
We'll come on to the issue of Western military aid for Ukraine in a moment, Hussein, because that does seem critical at the moment. In terms of what we're seeing from Russia, I mean, it feels like we're in this tit for tat stage where Ukraine launched certain strikes on Russian targets, and then we see vice versa. Obviously, Moscow has been shelling targets in Donetsk province, but also Kiev and Lviv and Kharkiv. What have you made of Russian attacks in recent weeks?
Well, these massive missile attacks, which Russia started launching quite recently, well, the preparations were certainly ongoing with the smaller scale attacks early on in December as well as in the late November, and they closely they closely resemble what Russia was doing last year with this massive wave of missile attacks against Ukrainian energy infrastructure, against Ukrainian military industry, and lots of other civilian or dual use targets. So apparently, Russia wants to continue the same campaign of terror and the same campaign of trying to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure, both civilian and dual use infrastructure. And probably the most remarkable fact about this recent large scale missile attacks is that Russia has been able to assemble a fleet of missiles over a certain period of time. Obviously, they have been accumulating these ballistic and cruise missiles apparently over a number of months, but they have been able to collect possibly hundreds of missiles that they can use against Ukraine now during this winter campaign phase. There certainly has been a lot of expectations that Russian military industry will not be able to produce as many missiles as they would need for sustaining something on this scale. For example, more precision guided missiles such as Kinjal missiles, which they're using actively against certain high value targets in Ukraine. But we've seen now a sort of a confirmation that the Russian military industry is coping with this demand for missiles, certainly not on the scale that Russia needs, but on the scale in order to keep Ukrainian air defenses occupied and in stress.
And how do you think Ukraine's air defences are coping this winter compared to last winter?
They're certainly coping much better because they have Patriot systems in their arsenal now, which they did not have last year, and they certainly have more advanced air defense systems than they used to have last year. But the big question is availability of missiles to supply these air defense systems, and they are completely reliant on Western partners to provide them with this highly costly military munitions, and this is certainly a big vulnerability for Ukrainian air defenses. And if last year we've seen Russia heavily relied on this relatively cheap so-called Shahed drones, which they have used against various targets, but mostly targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Now we're seeing, well, the Russians are still quite heavily reliant on this relatively low-cost drones, which apparently they're now manufacturing themselves rather than receiving them allegedly from Iran. But nevertheless, we're also seeing that Russia is able to use more of high precision missiles, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles. And ballistic missiles is a huge problem for Ukraine because apart from the Patriot systems, they do not have anything to tackle the ballistic threat at the moment. Russians are certainly aware about this vulnerability, and we can see them using more of ballistic missiles now rather than previously in order to hit potentially high impact targets such as uh, targets in the Ukrainian military industry. And we all know that there's been a relatively large scandal in Ukraine when anti-corruption services have released some data on location of Ukrainian military industry facilities, which apparently were uh, available in open access, and Russians have used this opportunity to target these facilities.
If Ukraine is not given the support it needs from the West in terms of extra missiles, extra military aid, extra air defense systems, When will we start seeing that having an impact on the front line? Do you think we are weeks away from seeing the impact of that? Because, of course, we're still waiting on Congress to approve more military aid for Ukraine. Do you think we're months away? When will Ukraine start noticing that shortfall?
Well, it will probably take a few months for Ukraine to start feeling a shortage of air defense missiles. They have been in a relatively difficult situation considering any sort of a Soviet vintage missiles for the systems that they have inherited from the Soviet Union and they've used in the first year of the war. But now Ukraine is more reliant on the Western air defense systems such as Patriot and Iris. T and quite a lot of other systems supplied by the Western partners. And if we will see a reduction in the number of munitions supplied by Western partners specifically for these systems, it is likely that Russia might step up its missile attacks, feeling that there are vulnerabilities and feeling that they can actually overwhelm the Ukrainian air defense system by these massive attacks. The other question is whether Russia has capacity to continue at the same scale attacks. We've seen around 100 missiles launched last time. They might be able to accumulate the same number of munitions over a period of a month or two. So this is not likely something that will develop over a week or a couple of weeks. So Russia definitely needs some time to accumulate the number of missiles it needs to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses. This is also a good thing for Ukraine because it will have time to receive, hopefully receive some supplies from the West and uh, possibly find some other channels to find munitions for its own air defense systems.
I wanted to ask you, Hussein, about the F-16s, which of course have been long waited for from the Ukrainians. And there was a report over the weekend that Denmark's Ministry of Defence said it was delaying the delivery of, I think, 6 F-16 jets to Ukraine by up to 6 months. Now, I think Ukraine have now come out and sort of disputed that somewhat. But were that to be the case, what would the impact of that be?
Well, it is certainly a negative impact on Ukraine's ability to defend itself. But overall, considering that the number of F-16 fighter jets, which will be supplied by various Western allied countries, is relatively limited, not going to be a game changer on the battlefield overall. Uh, the fighter jets are very much is an offensive weapon, and this is something Ukraine probably would have needed for their counteroffensive campaign during last summer, which didn't quite go according to the plan. And in the long term, certainly the supply of fighter jets to Ukraine is going to increase Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia, including bolstering its air defenses. But in the short run, they are not likely to change the situation on the ground, and they are not likely to be a game changer in terms of Ukraine's ability to uh, defend itself against these ongoing waves of Russian offensives in the Donetsk region, for example.
Is there any piece of weaponry, Hussein, that could be a game changer for Ukraine at the moment, or is it more complicated than that? I mean, people have talked about the F-16s. I've spoken to people on the front line in Ukraine who say actually what they just need is just shells. Essentially, that's the key thing they need. Is there any piece of kit that is going to be a game changer potentially?
I would doubt that there's any silver bullet that would change the war in either direction. So there's not likely to be a single piece of military equipment, a single weapon that would dramatically change the situation in Ukraine's favor or in Russia's favor. And it's absolutely true that Ukrainians need large quantities of artillery shells, and there's no Western or NATO country that is capable to provide them with this number of artillery shells. And the big problem for Ukraine is that since the collapse of Soviet Union, Ukrainian military industry has never been able to mass produce artillery shells, specifically for the Soviet vintage systems, but also for any other systems. And that puts Ukraine in a very difficult position. There were efforts in Ukraine since 2014, since the conflict with Russia began, to establish mass productions of artillery shells, which have not been very successful. Ukraine is now producing limited limited numbers of artillery shells, which are absolutely insufficient even to cover 10% of its own needs. So Ukraine is in a very difficult position when it comes to artillery production, partly because of the inability of successive Ukrainian governments to establish this production. So yeah, definitely, the higher number of artillery shells would have been helpful, but again, that won't probably have changed the situation dramatically in Ukraine's favor, because artillery shells certainly should come with artillery units themselves, which are also lacking in necessary numbers. So there's certainly, to answer your question, there's certainly no single weapon systems that I can think of which could actually change the situation in Ukraine's favor dramatically.
Just on the point about artillery shells, Hussein, I mean, I appreciate what you say that even if you were able to meet, for example, the EU's target of 1 million shells provided to Ukraine a year, which they're missing by a massive margin at the moment, that wouldn't necessarily be a game changer. But I'm sure there'll be people watching thinking, hang on a minute, why is it that the continent of Europe for the past 30 years has not been producing anywhere near enough artillery shells? Is it complacency? Is it an issue with our procurement? Is it the production capability? What is the issue?
Well, a lot of production factories had been shut down since the end of World War II. That was, for example, the situation here in the UK. A lot of facilities have been shut down, and there's probably only 20% capacity here in the UK. Of artillery shells production since the end of World War II. The situation is very similar in the rest of Europe. United States certainly producing probably the largest number of artillery shells among NATO countries, but still it's probably at 30% of the levels of production it had during the World War II. So there was a reduction in the need of artillery shells, also because in the transformation of the military doctrine and NATO doctrine of warfare, the expectation was that the NATO armies should be less reliant on artillery and more reliant on air power, focusing on precision strikes, on missile strikes, rather than using this large-scale World War One or World War Two type artillery barrages, or this obsession with artillery, which did used to exist during the World War conflicts. So there is a change in doctrine which was followed by the reduction in production of artillery shells. The results we are facing right now, so basically European states and NATO states overall are not prepared for a large continental warfare, and they are absolutely incapable to supply their allies such as Ukraine with a necessary number of artillery shells.
And is there any sign, Hussein, of that changing now, of European countries ramping up production to the extent that they would need to?
We're certainly seeing some increase in the number of facilities being opened up to produce higher number of artillery shells, and some of the factories being uh, updated or reused to work on artillery shell production, which have previously been producing other stuff. So there's certainly efforts. They're not on a massive scale, but we're seeing increased awareness, and we're seeing efforts to increase production of artillery shells. The same is in the case of Ukraine. Ukrainians are now realizing that they have to be self-reliant, that they have to produce more of their own munitions as well as more of their own weapons. They're building up factories, they're creating some new production lines, and they're starting to produce certain types of artillery shells which they need, specifically 152 millimeter and 122 millimeter shells. So they're starting to work on that, but this is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's going to take them at least a couple of years to develop mass scale production of artillery shells and other munitions that they need for their own military uh, industry.
I wanted to ask you, Hussein, about the casualty rate that Russia is sustaining at the moment on the front line. I mean, all kinds of estimates. The UK MOD, I think, came out recently saying it's something like 300 men a day, I think, more than this time last year, that Russia is sustaining in terms of losses, on course for maybe 500,000 losses this year alone. Is that sustainable? I mean, I keep asking guests we have on Frontline, does there come a tipping point where Russia can no longer sustain these losses? We know that Putin has very little regard for human life, so that's not an issue from his point of view, and he's happy to keep feeding men into the meat grinder. But does there come a point where it operationally will have an impact for Russia?
Well, this is what we have expected last year, and this is what we have expected this year during the Russian assault on Bakhmut, where they have sustained similarly high casualties. And this rate of casualties which Russia sustains nowadays will mostly happen around Avdiivka, where Russia is trying to seize this key city in Donetsk region, as well as further up north near Kupiansk, where Russia is also trying to seize that strategically important city. In terms of the casualty rates, well, for Western armies, these numbers of casualties would be absolutely unacceptable when a brigade loses less than 10% of its personnel. It is no longer considered suitable for offensive operations. But that's not the case with Russia, and in the case of Russian commanders on the battlefield, they feel compelled to send their men into battle, even if they sustain heavy casualties. In terms of the Russian ability to cope with these casualties, we have seen that Russia was more or less efficient in assembling reserves, into creating this system where individuals are constantly mobilized into Russian armed forces, either forcibly or attracted by financial incentives. This has provided Russia with relatively constant flow of reserves. There's certainly a lower quality military personnel than Russia used to have at the beginning of this invasion in the early 2022, but nevertheless, Russia is capable to assemble these assault brigades. Some of them are actually mobilized from prison inmates, similarly to how Wagner used to recruit its own combatants. And there's a number of these prison inmate brigades, Storm Z and Storm V, and so on. So Russia is more or less efficient in putting together this assault brigades that it uses in these ground combat operations, and it is likely that if the combat will continue at the same rate, if Russia will continue the same level of operations, which are fairly limited operations. They focused on seizing one or two strategic cities, and they're not taking any broad scale offensive along the front line. The operations are limited to relatively small territorial areas. They should be able to continue at the same level of offensives for a certain period of time, probably until presidential elections in Russia. And this is apparently the broader strategic political goal behind this current military operations in Donetsk region. They certainly have enough resources to continue these operations for another couple of months. Uh, Whether they will be able to achieve their operational goals or tactical goals, which is seizing this certain areas in Donetsk region, such as Avdiivka, for example, we don't know, but they're very close to it, and there is a chance that they will actually be able to take control of Avdiivka, at which point they will probably stop their offensive operations, and they will start preparing for next level of their offensives. That seems to be their strategy at the moment.
I want to come back to Avdiivka in just a moment, Hussein. Just on the point about recruitment, do you think we will see any change in Russia's recruitment policy after the presidential election in March? I mean, I know at the moment Putin, for example, I think in recent days has been trying to incentivize military service again by talking about support with housing. So he's obviously trying to drum up as much as many recruits as possible. But potentially after the presidential election, do you think he might look again at, for example, conscripting men from the big cities?
Uh, Whether Russia will declare total mobilization, it will probably depend on a number of factors. Firstly, on the immediate military objectives that Russia has in Ukraine, whether they want to continue large-scale offensives in order to seize more territory, for example, to take control of whole of Donetsk region, and to seize more lands in the Zaporizhia region, for example, or they want to continue defensive operations. In case if their focus is on defense, in case if their focus is on retaining those territories which they have managed to seize so far from Ukraine, there probably will be no need for large-scale mobilization, total mobilization, or another partial mobilization, and they will probably cope with the resources and mobilization efforts that they currently have. But in case if Putin declares something as another phase of the so-called counter special military operations that they have in Ukraine. In that case, they will probably need definitely more resources, human resources, and there is a chance that they will step up mobilization efforts. But it all comes down to actual military objectives that Russia has in Ukraine this year.
And on Avdiivka, is it your view, Hussein, that it is pretty inevitable now that Russia will capture it?
Well, the situation is quite hard. It was not that difficult. It was not so hard for Ukraine early on. It was not so dramatic for Ukraine. But over the last several weeks, Russians have made quite a number of advances. They've almost encircled Avdiivka, and it is increasingly hard for Ukraine to supply its troops in and around Avdiivka. And the chances that Ukrainians will be able to hold on to Avdiivka are quite limited. Just was the case with Bakhmut, and partially this is because Ukraine was not able to move reserves effectively because Ukraine didn't build sufficiently strong defensive positions around Avdiivka, just like in the case of Bakhmut. And unfortunately, lesson learning did not always occur in time in the case of this. Um Assault operations by Russian forces. So Ukrainians seem to be not particularly prepared to defend Avdiivka, and the situation is very difficult for Ukrainians at the moment. And if Russia will continue the assault on Avdiivka on the same scale. For a certain period of time, if they will be able to dedicate all the resources they're currently dedicating to seizing Avdiivka, they will probably succeed in that, and Ukraine will probably have to vacate Avdiivka, which I guess was a fact that is a fact that is more or less accepted in certain segments of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense and Ukrainian military overall.
And if and when that happens, Hussein, if Avdiivka were to fall, what should the reaction be in the West? I mean, is there a danger almost that it is seen as being more symbolically significant than it is actually strategically?
Well, I probably wouldn't expect too much of a reaction in the West because Avdiivka, I guess, is not considered by Western allies as a significant town or significant point of defense, which at which Ukraine will weaken, or at which point the Ukrainian defensive lines will collapse. There's certainly some. Avdiivka is certainly more strategically important than Bakhmut or than any of the other towns that Russia tried to seize more recently, such as Kupiansk in the north. The fall of Avdiivka will open up the opportunity for Russia to move on further into Donetsk region toward the larger cities such as Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And the bigger problem is that both of these cities are not particularly well defended, and approaches to both of the cities have not been sufficiently well defended. And now Ukraine is building up some fortifications and defenses, but unfortunately they've started doing it fairly late, and building extensive fortification lines in winter is a big challenge. So in case if Avdiivka falls, Russians will have fairly decent opportunities to advance towards these other urban centers in Donetsk region, which should be a cause for concern for Western allies, because that is something that is likely to weaken Ukrainian positions, especially in Donetsk region, and it's likely to reduce morale of the Ukrainian troops overall, as well as the Ukrainian ability to defend its positions in the east of the country.
And Hussein, just finally, what do you expect to see play out across 2024? Here we are at the beginning of 2024. We seem to be in this kind of positional warfare with people fighting over very small areas of territory. Do you expect that to continue, or do you think we'll see any significant changes in the nature of this conflict?
Well, my expectation would be that positional warfare will continue even more so than it did in previous years, especially in 2023, because both sides have relatively limited capacity to undertake larger military operations. In the case of Ukraine, it's quite obvious that Ukraine doesn't have any capacity to stage another counteroffensive. It has actually highly reduced capacity to defend its current positions, partly because of the failed counteroffensive and partly because of the reduction in military aid and also the need for more human resources. There's certainly this discussion of another wave of mobilization and obviously improvements to the current law on mobilization in Ukraine in order to assemble reserves and in order to increase the number of individuals serving in the armed forces. So Ukraine is certainly at the limit of its capacities at the moment. In case of Russia, Russia was obviously able to assemble some reserves, assemble some munitions and weapons over summer in order to stage this current offensive around Avdiivka in other areas of Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. But the Russian ability to continue the same level of operations is also questionable. And clearly, Russia doesn't have capacities to start something on a larger scale, for example, a broad front offensives along a larger territory of the front lines. So the question of capacity, the question of human reserves, and certainly the question of military production will probably keep the current state of warfare as a positional warfare, which we have been seeing for quite a while. And I would expect that the same level of small offensives and counteroffensives will continue throughout the year, but it's really difficult to expect something on a larger scale or some significant changes. Both sides are starting. Well, Russia have started to dig in quite a while ago, and Ukraine has realized the importance of building up defensive and fortified positions during its own counteroffensive when it has faced. Russia's defensive strengths. So both sides are likely to dig in and to prepare for a protracted positional warfare, and that's my expectation for this year.
Hussein, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.